Hello, hello, and welcome to the Bell Hook Center. My name is Dr. M. Shadi Malaklu, and I have the profound privilege of directing this space and chairing women's gender and sexuality studies here at Berea College. I am excited to welcome back to campus a spiritual confidant of Bell's and former visiting assistant professor of Berea College's own Studies of Religion and Spirituality department, currently an assistant professor in the Department of Theology at Xavier University, Reverend Dr. Leonard Curry. Reverend Dr. Curry is a writer, teacher, and scholar with expertise in Christian social ethics and with an eye towards interdisciplinary, de-disciplined, and undisciplined approaches to Black moral, social, and political thought. His research interests include the afterlife of the transatlantic slave trade, the formation of racial identities and the ways by which we identify, likewise affect and emotion, gender, sex, and sexuality, Black religions and Black Christianities, and the rhetoric of struggle. His written works examine Black religious women's anger and the need for intersectional approaches to disability theology. Indeed, Reverend Dr. Curry is deeply invested in the hope for personal and collective liberation. In today's talk, he shares his current research on, quote, war discourse, as it has been articulated in Black studies, marrying the popular critique of war discourse within Black studies with Bell Hooks' interest in a discourse and spirituality of peace, justice, and loving kindness. Engaging the Bell Hooks papers housed in Berea College's special collections and archives, Reverend Dr. Curry invites us to think and notably to feel with Hooks' formal and informal writings on spirituality, peace, justice, and conflict. Then and now, Bell Hooks' insights help us make sense of and curate our own ethic for navigating moments of conflict. I am grateful to serve as today's respondent. When I met Bell Hooks in 2019, I had no spiritual practice informed by an ethics of love. Instead, like most academics who come to this work, I had rage, anger, and pain. Like Bell, quote, I came to theory because I was hurting. Invoking the lessons of her own spiritual teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, Bell instructed me to, quote, take the ugliness and the mess of my rage and, quote, use it as compost for my garden. In the days and nights since her homegoing, I've sat with Bell's lessons, not least of all in my work as director of this center and as chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, where I facilitate feminist study not as the liberal pluralism whereby we add color and mix, a feminism which cannot account for the embodied and psychic pain that Bell fearlessly interrogated, but as a spiritual praxis of love that grapples with the lived experiences of dispossession and pain that her work asked us to look at. I look forward to continuing to dwell on Bell's insights, specifically her argument that love is a vehicle for justice, with Reverend Dr. Curry and you all today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the hard work of my colleagues, namely our student programmers and program associate Kat Moses, without whom none of what we do would be possible. I also want to thank today's co-sponsor, Berea College Special Collections and Archives, and especially my colleague Tim Binkley. Reverend Dr. Curry's visit marks a significant partnership between the Bell Hooks Center and Special Collections and Archives. We are thrilled to announce the launch of the Bell Hooks Papers Residency, a one-week opportunity to engage the 17 archival boxes that house Bell's journals, correspondence, manuscript drafts, pictures, and more. The program offers a stipend of $1,500 to anyone living more than 50 miles away. You can find more information about the residency on the Special Collections and Archives blog, as well as on the Bell Hooks Center's Facebook and Instagram accounts. Without further delay, please join me in wholeheartedly, egregiously welcoming back Reverend Dr. Curry. Right.
Good afternoon, everybody. So let me check in. You all need me on this mic, but you have me on this one. Okay, all right. Introductions are always a little awkward because people introduce you, you're like, who is that person? Thank you, Shadi, Dr. Malaklu, for that really warm and brilliant introduction. I'm very impressed by the person that you introduced. I don't feel like I'm that person, though. Um, Again, I'm Reverend Dr. Leonard Curry. You probably don't know me because I'm not as famous as the usual guest that Dr. Malaklu brings in. But I'm very glad to be here. Allow me to thank Dr. Malaklu as well, who's the director of the Bell Hooks Center and chair of WGSS, Tim Binkley, and the team at the Berea College Special Collections and Archives, and all those responsible for bringing the Bell Hooks Papers residency to life. I'm nervous. Can you tell I'm speaking so fast? I can feel it. I want to also shout out my friends and collaborators, Dr. DP Patrick, Dr. Megan Pfeiffer. Are you in the room? Okay, all right. Dr. Patrick Burrows, Dr. Jessica Clanderwood. Um, Today's remarks are my first pass at publicly speaking about the theme, the idea, the discourse, and the rhetoric of war. And my first pass at an attempt on the other side towards what it takes to countenance that theme, not tense up, not immediately become a combatant, not immediately move into fear, and how to win in war, not necessarily by not fighting, but perhaps by or through non extension, through or by ceasing to be or remain a battleground oneself. So, as this is my first pass, I would ask for your grace and your generosity, and I hope that this becomes a conversation. Speaking of, I want to publicly apologize to all of the brilliant scholars whose talks I've had the opportunity to attend in the past because I was so judgmental. And now that I'm teaching and have committee responsibilities and all of the things that life entails, I feel such a sense of kinship and am so impressed with what you were able to accomplish and sincerely ask for your forbearance for the past activity of my own mind. When I would tease my grandmother, she would just say back to me, keep living. And now that I have indeed kept living, I have all this ambition related hubris and perfectionism that I need to repent for. Finally, it is odd to say, but as highfalutin as this talk may or may not be, and may not be given the narrative nature of my work, looking, okay, all right, I'll make sure I lean forward and look to my right. The truth is that public presentations like this one cause me a lot of anxiety. And so when I do this, it's because I want to be in conversation with you instead of talking at you. As I search my heart, my mind, my body, my soul for a spirituality that is fitting for my life, occurring as it does in the context of wars and rumors of war, perhaps I need a spirituality also for the performance anxiety that I coexist with or that coexists within me. Perhaps I'm searching for a spiritual practice that lets me tell the truth in public without sacrificing sleep or conjuring chasms or perceiving phantasms. Perhaps I'm looking for something like a spirituality of and sustained by peace. Part one, I declare war. There are two stories I want to tell you from my childhood to introduce you to my thinking around the theme of war. The first is the card game that we played in Cleveland, Ohio in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s that was literally called War. Y'all know it? Okay, all right. The game was simple. It was played, at least for us, with 2 to 4 persons. We never went past four. I think at that point we thought that the deck would be spread too thin or the cards would be uneven. And despite being really good at card math, it could be that we didn't figure out how to take the cards and divide it evenly past 4 people, Or like the councils deciding the number of gospels, we too thought that four was perfect. In the game War, my religion people laughed. In the game War, you were dealt your cards, then you gathered them together in a little deck without fixing or arranging them beyond making them neat. For the most ardent of us, you wouldn't even look at the cards, right? You didn't want to know what you had. Introduced a theme of happenstance. The game was in responding to what came without knowing precisely what was coming. And then you played. Each round, you drew a card from the top of your pile and you played that card against the cards being played by other persons in the game. Whoever had the highest card won the round. Stacked those cards either at the bottom of their deck or in a separate pile to form a new deck, and then you all moved on to the next round. The game got interesting as you went along. You saw who had face cards, those aces, kings, queens, etc., and you saw who had lower cards, like a deuce or a four. If you made it spicy, there was a joker thrown in the mix, or twos were made wild, deuces were wild. That provided an additional element of happenstance. Jokers and wild deuces changed the power player, so to speak, increasing their numbers so that there were ostensibly more opportunities to win. But then there were the wars. Say you and another person played a card with the same value, an eight of spades against the eight of diamonds. Then what you do is that you go to war. You lay down three cards and say, I declare, and then drawing one more card, you turn it over and say war. Whoever had the highest card won that round. If your cards had the same value, you repeated the battle. I declare war. The second story is about a friend of my family named BR to protect his identity. BR was a friend of my mom's and uncle's generation. And he used to say, well, I declare. I mean, it's good southern drawl, very Blanche Devereaux. I declare, I do declare. Um, and when I think of the game War and the declaration of war, I can't help but hear it in his voice. So I declare war has become I do declare war. In the work of Frank Wilderson, I found the declaration of war. And this is true in many different ways. I think I made an assumption here that many of the people in the room would know who Frank Wilderson is. But Frank Wilderson is considered the signal voice in Afro-pessimism. From his work in Cognigro to his political work in South Africa with one of the freedom fighting parties, to his book Red, White, and Black, to his recent book, his 2020 text Afro-pessimism. He's been the most forethought speaker on the idea of Afro-pessimism. So in his work, I found the theme, the operation of war. And this is true in many different ways. First, simply linguistically. Wilderson deploys language like enabling antagonism, positionality, or position absolute dereliction. Right? I apologize if this part is like, again, highfalutin. The early Wilderson, the Wilderson of 2003 at least, investigated the utility of Gramscian Marxism for the subject position of the Black American. Most people in Black studies have read his essay, Gramsci's Black Marx. I felt fortunate to find an essay from him titled The Prison Slave as Hegemony's Silent Scandal, published in Social Justice from that same year, from 2003. In that essay, Wilderson makes a series of claims and maneuvers that I will ultimately fail at summarizing here. First, he declares that both civil society and the Black body are in a mutual antagonistic relationship with one another, that the existence of the one threatens the destruction of the other. It's giving Voldemort and Harry Potter. Then he goes on to claim that Gramscian discourse and Gramscian related movements fail for Black persons because the quintessential subject imagined by Gramscian discourse is the worker. And that worker is solicited by hegemony, which is an ensemble of consent and influence and leadership. And when the state acts to imperil that worker, the worker can withdraw his or her consent, right? And they can enact strategic antagonisms that would enable their liberation, their freedom, right? Their ability to reconfigure society. Gramscian discourse, I would say Wilderson is arguing, is not transposed or made to fit the American context, and so it does not read race. Anti-blackness or white supremacism is not read as part of the base, but as superstructure. And again, forgive me if this is highfalutin. And so, Gramscian discourse cannot imagine the subordinated subject position that is black. The black for Wilderson is not the worker. For Wilderson, it is better to think of the black as the slave. And so you can see that the slave, in light of the worker, would have different needs. Work is not freedom for the slave, Wilderson argues. Work is something that would need to cease. Moreover, the state may solicit the consent of the black person or the slave, but it is not required. If black people withdraw their consent, it does not necessarily affect the operations of the state, according to Wilderson. And finally, the condition that the worker calls the crisis is already the condition of the black or the slave. And therefore, the enabling antagonisms that may work for the worker do not respond to the crisis and do not respond to or do not work for the slave. So, what's the solution? The solution for Wilderson is to join the dance of death, his language, right? For radicals to take up the position of the slave. If you really want to do something about this crisis, then you have to join yourself to the slave, to join your justice movements, your liberation movements, your movement for liberation to the liberation of black people. This would be a program of complete disorder, he says. This hope, as odd as that sounds to label that a hope, is articulated in the language of civil war. He says, quote, whereas the positionality of the worker, whether a factory worker demanding a monetary wage, an immigrant or a white woman demanding a social wage, gestures towards the reconfiguration of civil society, the positionality of the black subject, whether a prison slave or a prison slave in waiting, gestures towards the disconfiguration of civil society. For the coherence of civil society, the black subject beckons the incoherence of civil war, a war that reclaims blackness not as a positive value, but as a politically enabling site, to quote Fanon, of absolute dereliction. It is a quote unquote scandal that rends civil society asunder. Civil war then becomes the unthought but never forgotten understudy of hegemony. It is a black specter waiting in the wings, an endless antagonism that cannot be satisfied via reform or reparation, but must nonetheless be pursued to the death. Deep breath. I have always found Wilderson's writing to be compelling yet brutal. For me, it demands a sort of ego death, if not, in fact, a literal death. For my own justice making to be somewhat coherent, if I'm understanding Wilderson right, I must become more than phenotypically black, right? More than black by the surface of my skin or the shape of my nose. Instead, I must join the dance of death, throw in my lot with the living dead, and be with those who live and work, live maybe not, who work at the social edges. That seems almost consistent with the person of Jesus Christ, but that's we'll talk about that maybe another time. You can ask me questions about that. For my ethical musings to be somewhat consistent, instead of rejecting Wilderson's argument out immediately, I need to figure out what it might mean to internalize and integrate it. Wilderson has declared war, and seemingly, as a black person, as a person who wants to do justice in the world, I have already chosen this side. Part 2, a spirituality for blackness at war. Once I saw the theme of war in Wilderson's work, I started to see war everywhere. I heard it in the language of politicians. I saw it in the work of various authors I was reading. I even found it in the Bible. How many know the Apostle Paul? For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly realms, right? Ephesians 6 and 12. Or how about 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 10 and 4? For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. I found the theme of war in Marcus Rediker's The Slave Ship, where he informed me that the ship also functioned as a warship. There he writes, quote, what each of them, captain, sailor, African captive, found in the slave ship was a strange and potent combination of war machine, mobile prison, and factory. Loaded with cannon and possessed of extraordinary destructive power, the ship's war-making capacity could be turned against other European vessels, forts, and ports in a traditional war of nations, or it could be turned to and sometimes against non-European vessels and ports in imperial trade or conquest. The slave ship also contained a war within, as the crew, now prison guards, battled slaves, prisoners, the one training its guns on the others who plotted escape and insurrection. Moreover, my investigations into the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church in 2015, the topic of my dissertation, returned me to the theme of war. It was, after all, Dylan Roof's intention, or so he said, to start a race war. But it was also my investigation into the theme, discourse, and rhetoric of war with respect to Mother Emanuel that turned up an anomaly. Nadine Collier, in an act of non-aggressive aggressivity, told Dylan Roof that she forgave him. Now, this was the shot heard around the world, or rather, this was the act of forgiveness heard around the world. From feeling embattled or embattlement as the primary affective disposition or position that I was in, to being curious, if not also a bit concerned, I wanted to know what the hell just happened. Nadine Collier's offer of forgiveness returned awe and curiosity to me in a way that I still find difficult to explain. Investigating this site of forgiveness, some of you may have been a part of those initial investigations if you were in my classes back in 2019 and 2020. I first thought it to be a sign of cheap grace, right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer's cheap grace. It felt too easy, too simple, too lacking in complexity. But having been shown the theme of war and starting to see it over and over and over again, Nadine showed me that one does not simply surrender, or one does not have to simply surrender themselves to the spirit of an unending bellicosity. You can be more than simply the extension of the interlocutory life of war. Well, how do you do that? And that is why this presentation is short, because I don't know. To be honest, that is where I am in the present. I am searching for a spirituality that sides with those consigned to social death, but that does not require me to extend the life of war. I do not want to be war's puppet, not Paul's war, not the state's war, nor even Frank's war. I believe in my heart that Black people are religious or spiritual, pick your favorite word, in a way that is simultaneously celebrated and castigated. Black spirituality exists in this modern world in a double bind. On the one hand, you cannot trust yourself and your own spiritual intuitions, dispositions, or moods. But on the other hand, you can trust yourself when you have been properly formed. And properly formed by what? Well, an orthodox white version of Christianity. And so even when Christianity is Black or Black African, it is often still beholden to structures and strictures that further elaborate the bind that I just named. At dinner the other night, I had a chance to talk about this with my colleague and collaborator, Dr. D.P. Patrick. And one of the things that Dr. Patrick named for me was that this is a violence to one's spiritual imagination, and helped me to see that my own spiritual struggles could be thought about again in the context of war. Ultimately, this is what I think Bell has to teach me, and I'm so glad that I am here. I'll end then with this final little brief story. When I was here, I had a chance to meet Bell. It was very interesting because Bell worked through other people. I forget Linda's last name, but Linda was here. Linda Strongly. She was here as the provost, if I'm not mistaken, and was an intimate partner, conversation partner with Bell. And so I got a call from Linda saying that Bell wanted to meet me. It was very that's how it worked, right? So I got the call, and Linda met with me first to vet me. It was a process, um, and then after that meeting, gave me Belle's number and said, call her. So when I called Belle, it was a very brief and awkward conversation. I didn't know her, right, and all I knew was her fame, and as essentially eventually we decided on the phone that I would go get Mexican food and we would have dinner at her house. And so that's what I did. While I was there having a conversation with her, she kind of intimated to me that she wanted me to start a church here. Right? She didn't say it directly, but she talked about how she had tried to form spiritual community here and how that endeavor had been not sustainable. It had been hit or miss. She had had some successes, but it never seemed to sustain. It always fell apart. And I answered the call, but not in the way that I think I was supposed to. I reached out to my bishop and said, "Hey, I feel like I'm called to pastor a church," with the hopes that my bishop would say, "Okay, start a mission in Berea." And instead, I was sent about 2 hours away to the far east of Kentucky to pastor a church there. Um, by the time she told me this, Bill was sick, and like I said, I did start pastoring, so I answered the call that she inaugurated, just in a different way. I think that I'm returning to Bill into the archives in an effort simply not to get it right this time around or not to be perfect, but to finally be oriented towards a spirituality of peace that makes sense for embattled Black persons such as myself and anyone else with whom such a spirituality may resonate. So here we stand at the door. May our journey be blessed. Thank you.
With an injury disability. Thank you,
Yeah, of
Reverend
course.
Dr. Curry, for that series of provocations.
Absolutely.
You brought up so much that resonates with the themes involved in the classes I teach, as well as my own scholarship. I I think it's really telling that you described not a spirituality of war, but a spirituality of peace as a kind of truth telling, which is how Bell described her feminist intervention.
Mm.
She said that she called it a radical truth telling, and in describing her truth telling, Beverly Guy Sheftall described her voice as loud and unrelenting.
Mm.
One thing that's occurred to me in the last year and a half is that where Bell's feminism led with love, today's feminism leads with cancel culture.
Mm.
And I'm as petty as anyone, and there's a lot that feels good about that. But I think and I wonder, how can we be loud and unrelenting, unapologetic, a talking back, while still leading with love, or as you have described it, a spirituality of peace? I am a student of Frank Wilderson's.
Yeah.
I was trained by him, but I describe myself as a recovering Afro-pessimist because I do feel that a lot of the interventions that are claimed by Afro-pessimism have been made by Black women.
Mm.
And one notable intervention is Belle's. Until the day she died, she was saddened by the way the world received her when she made a comment about Beyonce, that Beyonce was colluding in the image of herself as a slave. She got torn apart by that, by feminists. And here we go again. I think no more than 5, 6, 7 years later, Frank Wilderson gets an entire spread in the New Yorker about his argument that Black people are ontologically, or the meaning of their being, inherited by a structure that is antagonistic to Blackness as slaves. So who pays the price for the critique is, I think, an interesting question to ask. I also really appreciate...
Dr. Malaklu, can I interrupt you so that this
Yes.
can be a conversation?
Please, I hope. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I was like, because I don't have an answer to any of these, but what I've discovered as a scholar is that I come alive in conversation.
Yeah.
And I love, this is how I make friends, right? This is what I think scholarly friendship looks like. Okay, so who pays the cost for the intervention is such a good question. And we can think about this too. I mean, it's such a good question. I've been thinking a lot about how there's a spirit, if you will, right? Using that word loosely, in Silicon Valley right now, of move fast and break things, right?
Neoliberalism.
Call it what you want to, right? Like that's probably the perfect frame for it, but that's absolutely the spirit. And that is the same spirit that's moving into our governance, right? Especially with the appointment of Elon Musk to whatever he's appointed to. It's like officially, unofficially lead of Doge. But who? Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and the other millionaires and billionaires in his cabinet are protected from the effects of their actions by their wealth. And so the people who wind up paying the cost of that are the people who needed the service in the first place. Right? So the folks impacted are the people who needed the medicines and the aid workers from USAID. Right? And the folks impacted are the environmental folks, right? The living creatures, where the site of SpaceX launches its rockets from, right? Essentially, we are going to pay the cost of that high level of immiseration, right? At any rate, again, this is not Wilderson, I believe, doesn't pay the cost for his analysis of the Black as the slave because it happens at such a high theoretical level. Like it's a
and Bell is accessible.
And Bell is accessible, right? So the very feminism, the very critique that she made and then performed, right, practiced. She critiqued the way in which scholarly discourse takes place that is inaccessible to average people, common people, and then she started to write in a way that was accessible. Because she wrote in a way that was accessible, she paid the cost, right, for that accessibility. So Wilderson can launch an argument in highfalutin discourse that nobody understands, and because nobody understands it, and it's valued right by a small circle of people, it's given a lot of esteem and celebrity. Bell pays the cost because she's accessible. And I also want to say there's something about like Wilderson's discourse being. I think that there is a way in which the relationship between abstraction and like materiality is shifted in Wilson's conversation. So he's abstract about very material things, right? The Marxist discourse ultimately is a highly abstract discourse, but about the most material thing. It's about your body and your labor power, right? It's about who has the means of production. But once you start speaking in language of means of production and use value and labor power, you've lost all the people, right? So, but you can have it's an abstract discourse about a very material thing. Whereas when you talk about Beyonce, she is people's hero, right? Like people love her. And so it was really easy for people to not get lost in the discourse and to therefore want to defend a figure like, and I do mean a figure, right? Because whoever Beyonce is, she's also hidden by her wealth.
Yes.
right? And she does
And
not
that was
say,
Belle's critique as well.
she does not say a lot in public. And listen, I love Beyonce. I love Beyonce down. I got a ticket to the concert, right? But I understand that who Beyonce gives us is a public performance. It's a public performance of herself, and we are consuming that public performance. And who she is hidden behind her wealth as well.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I want to add one more comment that marries the two parts of your talk, and then we're going to open it to Q&A. In the part one, I declare war, you talked about the game of war as something that happens without fixing or arrangement, something that leans into happenstance. And then you help us, understand the concept whereby Afro-pessimism asks us to, quote, join the dance of death. And that this is, if you lean into blackness as a subject that is not one, then that becomes a politically enabling site, right? To lean into social death rather than clamor for one's human recognition. And so I wanted to think about, a comrade, co-conspirator of Frank's, Jared Sexton, talks about the social life of social death, that leaning into social death is not a closed door to relationality, but a portal into another, AN/capital O other, sociality. And he takes the example of Topsy from the Colored Museum. He says, dance to the madness, for there is freedom there in our unending, uninterrupted captivity, a mad freedom where there is none, right? And so if social death is a stagnation, what would it mean to inhabit that stagnation? For example, if you don't have movement through time, twirl through time, skip rocks against man's coordinates, right? Existing outside of the box of the human is an immense possibility for another kind of living in an elsewhere and elsewhen that we can perceive and hope for and reach for, but we can't name it. We can't recognize it because per Marx, right? And this is where I think we don't realize that Fanon is engaging Marx, right? Marx's 18th Premiere plays a role in the way Fanon thinks in his conclusion of Black Skin, White Masks. He says the social revolution could not take its model from the past because all that does is reproduce the current conditions of possibility and impossibility. Instead, we need an idea that exceeds its expression in our current hegemonic common senses. I say that while at the same time recognizing that when Frank says in Gramsci's Black Marx that let's not call it the question of Black Americans or Black people diasporically. Let's call it the cow question, he says. He says, Black people are not being exploited. They are being accumulated, warehoused, and if need be, killed. He says the cows need some assurances before they raise a hoof for the revolution. Those are his exact words. And that really honed for me the absolute positional disjuncture between the consent of the worker and the fact that consent or not, you were going to be in a position of racial sexual terror, right? And so I really do think that in today's world, I open this up for discussion of honoring the predicament of anti-Blackness as unique, while at the same time understanding that that might be a model, a portal that we might learn from in order to also create different conditions of possibility, not least of all in this political moment.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Thank you, Dr. Reverend Curry.
Thank you.
Shall we open it up to questions? We have some time. About 15 minutes.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Patrick.
Two tiny mics.
Thank you. I have so many questions. You can probably guess, but the one that I'm going to raise at the moment is also having been paused over and over and over again by Nadine Collier's offer of forgiveness. I think about Matthew Potts' book where he talks about forgiveness as an expression of grief, and of the unassailability of grief, and that one forgives because one must mourn. So I wonder, like, how does grief and mourning play into a spirituality of peace against war?
Mm, that is such a great question. Um, do
Do we want to take a few?
Okay, sure,
Yeah,
sure.
it's up to you.
Let's go one at a time, and then
Okay.
I'll do my best to answer them as well as I can. Um, so the simple answer is yes. But how they work together is yet to be, for me, unfurled. I think that part of the reason that I'm interested in affect is because of this very reason, right? I think since we have known each other, I've been asking questions about affect. So my big question when we first met was the relationship of shame to historiography. And then as I moved into my PhD program, it became a question of anger, like its accessibility and a pedagogy of anger. How, like, who can access anger and why? Like, what has constructed us such that we have access to that emotion socially, right? Publicly, not just within our individual persons, though we often internalize what is external. Um, when I talked about Nadine in my dissertation, what I eventually said was that there was a demand placed on her for the performance of rage and anger that she could not meet, right? She couldn't meet that demand. And her offer of forgiveness, the way that I described it in my dissertation, was that it's percussive, but it's also halting. Um, she she says, to everybody in the room, to you, the judge. This isn't verbatim. I don't have Shadi's memory, but performing the way that I remember it. And then she looks at Ruth, who's there, but on a closed circuit camera. To you, I just want you to know, I forgive you. Right? It's like, is this percussive forgiveness? But as she continues her speech, she starts breaking down. You took something precious from me. You took, I'll never get to hold her again. Her mother, right, was murdered in the shooting. And you can tell that at the end, she has to stymie or staunch the flow of her grief to return to forgiveness. And for me, there's a difference, right? Like, grief is something that demands process. It has its say, right? It will have its day. And it feels to me like what she did was inhibit her own grief so that she could get to forgiveness. And that relationship is what prohibited any conversation about anger or rage, right? Because that offer of forgiveness was fewer than 48 hours after the shooting took place, right? So, yeah, of course.
An argument that Afro-pessimists make that I think is quite convincing, and my students in my GSTR capstone have learned, is the argument that sometimes Black pain is subordinate to white feelings. And so your example led me to remember Botham Jean, who was killed because a white woman she was in her off time, cop, came into the wrong apartment and thought it was her apartment and shot him dead. What really concerns me is that in the court case to follow, the Black female judge hugged her, his brother hugged her, his mother hugged her, because her feelings, Frank Wilderson says anti-Blackness is not a kind of discrimination, it's a kind of psychic health for the rest of the world. And so, like, that I think is interesting, right? That there is that why in that moment where she shot that man, she lynched that man, right? Is it so important to comfort her? And I think that we have to think about that in this moment as well. Even Bell Hooks, two years I think before Trump's first win, said push come to shove, white women will choose their race before their gender. They will choose white privilege before sisterhood. And then of course we saw a lot of white women vote him in office while Black women were blamed for not voting. Again, I'm not creating a valuation on anyone here. And whiteness is not unique to white people. Whiteness is a culture that we all smuggle in. You know, the way we walk, the way we talk, what we wear, how we create relationships. But I do think that idea of feeling is important, right? The affect that you're talking about.
Yeah. And before we take the next question, just to tack on to that, they said in the courtroom, Botham John's brother, Brant John, yeah, Gene. I always say John because I know that they're a French family, they're a Haitian family. So in my head, anyway, so Brant says something to the effect of like, I think that like my God would want me to forgive you or something like that. He invokes religion and in particular Christianity, which again raises questions about Christianity's participation in this kind of epistemological imperialism that Black people seem to suffer from, this inaccessibility of feeling and the inability to be in touch with their own religious or spiritual intuitions. Oh, okay. Sorry, I don't know. All right. Okay.
We'll get there. Can I give you this tiny mic too? The tiny mic is so tiny and so cute. I can just clip it to you.
Oh, cool, cool. So in our I'm in like Black feminist theory with Dr. M, but when you talk about like spirituality, especially like Black spirituality, do you see, well, at least I'm trying to like get this out in the most academic way
No,
possible.
go for it. Just, yeah, don't worry about
If
it.
like, do you see what I've at least what I've noticed is that Black spirituality is usually seen as like the pinnacle of spirituality, where a lot of
Mm,
people will look to that for guidance. Um, and be like kind of like almost base stereotypes on that. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are kind of on that subject.
yeah, I do have some thoughts on that, which I'm glad to share. I think that a lot of it has to do with the civil rights movement. Um, and essentially, there's a moment in African American history before the 1950s where I don't know, there's almost like a silliness attached to Black culture. Like, and if you go and read, if you have like access to archives or if you find it on the internet, check out like some of the first issues of Jet magazine and what they were talking about. It's wild. It's like it's so and so cheating on their spouse, right? I mean, it's a gossip rag, right? And of course, there are Black newspapers that don't do that thing, but there are also some Black newspapers that do that thing as well, right? Because they were trying to figure out how to be sold. Um, and what you see if you study those Jet magazine, the the magazines themselves, is that there's a transformation around the time of the civil rights movement. I think it's after the publication of Emmett Till's photo that suddenly there's a way in which publicly Black folks need to do more media management, more social management. And that happens in part through Black religiosity. Yeah, Black religion becomes the way in which Black people are taken seriously in the public, in part because the civil rights movement is organized through churches or through religious people. And that has to do with like what happens post enslavement and with Reconstruction and all of the northern missionaries coming to the South and bringing a kind of a denigration of Black Southern culture that had been created, right? And you need to embrace this Northern religiosity in order to have an intelligible personhood, right? So religion becomes the grid by which, or the matrix by which people perform themselves. So um, there's the National Women's Convention, National Women's something that's founded by like these Black women. If you read, if you want a text that can tell you all about this period, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's Righteous Discontent is a perfect text for this. Um, if you all have ever used the expression politics of respectability, you're using Higginbotham's expression. Darlene Clark Hine is also a really good Black woman historian, since we're making sure to not erase the work of Black women around this. Um, but those women are the women who give birth to Dr. King. Dr. King's mother is a part of that Black Women's Club movement. So his policies of respectability that he has in the early, if you go and read his speeches too from like the early 1950s, and he's telling people to like put on deodorant, and you're just like, what? You know, it's wild the transformation that takes place in struggle and the transformation that takes place over the course of just a few decades. But to your point, I think that there's a certain ascendancy that layer of Black culture was selected to be the representative layer to the states, and that's the layer that's amplified and circulated. And so to be witnessed as Black or to be intelligible as Black, you need to fit into this particular layer that's been amplified and circulated. And it's a religious layer, it's often a Christian religious layer, and it's usually Black folks have had to pay a high price for their orthodoxy. This is what I was saying, like towards the end. I'll tell this story. Again, it's not my story, but I'm formed by it deeply. I grew up in a family where, I have a family member who was said to like have been here before, right? They said that she knew things when she was a child that she could not have possibly known because they happened before she was born. And that she would tell her siblings, her brothers and sisters about stuff that they were doing, again, that she could not possibly have known because she was in the house while they were out in the world. I grew up hearing those stories, but what I found as I became a religious studies major, as I got a degree in seminary, as I got a PhD in social ethics, is that those stories are inadmissible, right? They're inadmissible. They don't have a place. You have to carve out space for those stories. You really have to do something different than what is the norm. Another story, I was at church because I'm a church kid, right? At least I was for a very long time. It's still deep down in there. If you say God is good, I'm probably still gonna say all the time. And I was at church, and we were reading a passage from the Bible in which the disciples they see Jesus walking on water and they think he's a ghost. And I say, oh wait, hold on, I just caught that. They think Jesus is a ghost. And they were like, yeah. And I was like, but that means that they have an epistemology, a spiritual worldview that includes ghosts. Like, isn't that interesting? Like, what do y'all think about that? And so we got into a conversation. And because, it was an AME church and most of the people in the room were older, right? Because that's just the way the churches are going, especially Black churches. They started telling stories. Well, I remember when Mama died, I saw her in the room at the foot of my bed. And so told me that I had to go open the window in order to let them out, right? They started sharing stories, and the pastor got so uncomfortable. This is a Black pastor. He got so uncomfortable that he was like, all right, we need to get back to the text because the text is what is licit. The text is what is authorized, right? But those lived folk spiritualities are what are not permitted. And again, I think that has something to do with the ascendancy of a certain Black religiosity, right? It's a dance we have to dance with. I don't want to celebrate or condemn it. I think it's something to look out for and to study. We are running out of time and we haven't gotten to everyone's question, but Reverend Dr. Curry will stick around for a few moments. If you're in my Black feminist theory class, please also stick around for a few moments. I want to give a wholehearted gesture of gratitude to Reverend Dr. Curry for walking us through some really difficult concepts, really difficult empirically salient concepts. I also want to let everyone know that our next Gender Talk speaker is Sierra King, who specializes in Black feminist archive making and an archive of the self. This is also a partnership with Special Collections and Archives, and insofar as the day after her talk, she will be offering a workshop to faculty and staff, and we can even let in students, I think, yeah, who want to learn about kind of self-archive making. So please be on the lookout for that. And again, Reverend Dr. Curry, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.